Well, thank you very much. It's a terrific honor to get this, and in particular for several reasons. I mean, first of all, because of my great admiration for the work of Leontief, who provided the foundation of so many valuable advances, and also whose attitude to economics I totally share in a skepticism of economics based on what he described as theoretical assumptions and non-observed facts. And that's particular relevance to macroeconomics today, I must say. Theoretical assumptions and non-observed facts. And his emphasis on the need to collaborate across disciplines. Secondly, I'm very honored because of my respect, friendship, and admiration for every single previous awardee. And this is a club I'm very proud to be a member of, and particularly to get it with Albert Hirschman. And I was thinking when you mentioned getting ahead collectively, I think after a long career, which has been very much devoted to identifying policy change in a normative way, I've come to the conclusion that the most important thing is getting ahead collectively. That without collective action, you might as well, go home. That we make a lot of words, but it's collective action which brings about the change. So it's fantastic. Now, today I want to talk about horizontal inequalities, why they matter, and some global implications. And this is broadly what I'm going to be doing. I want to take up one global example. I may have to do it fairly quickly, but still. Well, horizontal inequalities, what are they? The normal focus when you talk about inequalities is inequalities among individuals, or sometimes among nations, and we have the Gini coefficient, and we know about it. I'm going to call that vertical inequality. Horizontal inequality, in contrast, is inequality between groups. And sort of groups we're talking about are racial groups, ethnic groups, religious groups, gender groups, age groups. Of course, you can have national groups, regional groups, and maybe class groups. Any group in which there's a sense of identity among the members, so they have a sort of binding identity. Now, I accept, and I'm sure people in the audience, if there are any anthropologists here, will ask me if I don't say, that groups and identities are socially constructed. They're not intrinsic to us, but they are also very meaningful to us. And I also accept, of course, that we all have multiple identities. We don't have a unique one. But at particular points in our lives, there is one identity which is of overriding importance, and at other points, other identities are of overriding importance. Today I'm being an academic, another day I might be being something quite different. Now, I want to take a multidimensional view of inequalities. So again, normally, most economists think about income inequality and occasionally wealth. And of course, there are many other aspects of economic inequalities going beyond that. Employment's very important, but there are others. There are also inequality in access to social services and access to social networks, sometimes known as social capital, but there are inequalities. Asymmetric social capital is very important. Also inequalities in power. Some groups have a lot of power, other groups don't. And then there's inequalities in cultural recognition. What is the recognition that your particular group gets in a society? All four are important, and not just the economic one. Now, my view is that horizontal inequalities are important in two ways. One, as a source of injustice, and secondly, as a source of political mobilization, often violent mobilization. And I got into this topic through the lens of violent mobilization. I've only recently begun thinking about justice, but today I want to say more about justice and only briefly about violence. So, turning to justice, what I have been doing is taking both philosophers and economists and looking at some selected ones, and here I'm going to be a subset because I haven't so much time, and thinking, what have they got to say about inequality? And what they say is normally addressed to inequality among individuals. What if we try and interpret it as inequality among groups? Do we get to the same conclusions, different conclusions? How does it work? Let me start with Rawls as a representative sort of social contract theory, and he justifies inequality if and only if it improves the condition of the poorest. Now let's think of that in terms of groups. Inequality might improve the position of the poorest if you thought, forgetting about groups for a minute, that you needed incentives to make people efficient, to make people save, and things like that. So you have some inequality for that reason. Does that work for groups? On the whole, it does not, because if you have large groups, there isn't differences in talent and effort and so on. You may need incentives within the group. You may need those incentives, but they will apply to inequality within the group. When it comes to between the groups, there's no reason why, say, blacks and whites should have, we've got to have incentives because we've got to have inequality between blacks and whites to have sufficient incentives. So I think that you get less justification for inequality if you apply it to groups than if you do it to individuals. Let me turn to Nozick. I turn to Nozick because he's the most inegalitarian philosopher currently that one can think of. And he says that what matters is process, not outcomes. In other words, if you have a just process, which he defines as that legitimate process by which you acquire resources and legitimate process by which you transfer resources, like leaving it to people, then the outcome is just, which means you can get a huge amount of just inequality. Because there's any initial inequality, you leave it to your children, that's just, and so it accumulates. But he's got a principle of rectification, which isn't very often referred to. And this principle says, if you didn't acquire the resources legitimately in the first place, but you get some people steal from others, he says, they defraud them, they enslave them, then the initial inequality is not just, and nor is the subsequent inequality, because it all starts from injustice. Now let's think about group inequality. Almost every group inequality has at its source some enslavement, some stealing, some defrauding. If you think about racial inequality, ethnic inequality, and so on. So once again, even when you take a very sort of conservative approach to inequality, it's more difficult to find justice for group inequality than for individual. I want to now think a little bit about economists. Economists look both intrinsically and instrumentally at the issue of inequality. Intrinsically, initially, economists were very egalitarian. You start with Pigou, or we don't start with Pigou, but let me take Pigou, a brilliant economist of the early 20th century. And he argued that you'd have diminishing returns to utility. As you had more income, you'd get less utility. Sounds reasonable. So therefore, you needed, if you wanted to maximize utility, you should redistribute from the rich to the poor, because the poor would get more utility out of that marginal income. All right, that sounded fine, but, of course, one found a reaction, and we turned to Robbins, who's been referred to earlier. Robbins said, you could not say that, because in our heart of hearts, he said, we do not regard different men's satisfaction from similar means as equally valuable. For some strange reason, this statement, which was entirely an intuitive statement on the behalf of Robbins, had overwhelming influence on the economics profession, who all agreed that you could not make cardinal comparisons in utility between individuals. Now remake that statement, but don't talk about different men, talk about different groups. Could we really say in our heart of hearts we do not regard men and women's satisfaction from similar means as equally valuable, or different ethnic groups' utility? We do not regard, we can't say that. We would say that, blacks get so much less utility than whites, or one ethnic group than another. I don't think we could say it. I think it would rule out that statement, and we'd be back to a much more Pigovian world. Let's now turn to instrumental reasons, because economists did accept the Robbins proposition, and so they only wanted inequality if it was instrumentally useful. You get a Pareto optimum, but if you could prove that you could lift the whole thing, maybe then you could get some redistribution, everyone was getting better off. Then again, we have to turn to the issue of whether that is the case for groups, and back to the same rules position. For individuals, you need incentives and so on, but for groups, it seems much less plausible. Economists often now today talk about equality of opportunity. And if you define equality of opportunity very broadly, meaning equality in all circumstances not in the control of the individual, or what I've got a quote here, or morally irrelevant predetermined circumstances such as race, gender, place of birth, and family background, well, that says it all. Once again, group inequality rules out that sort of inequality. So if you want equality of opportunity in this broad sense, which is now widely used and developed by Roma and others, and widely used actually even in the World Bank, you rule out group inequality. You still have individual inequality, but you rule out group. So what I'm arguing, very briefly, is that most theories of justice, it's very difficult to justify group inequality. It's much easier to justify some vertical inequality because of the effect it has on incentives and growth and so on. I want to turn now to horizontal inequality and political instability, which is, as I said, where I sort of started. Because I started on this topic because I was looking at the causes of conflict in the world, and a lot of people had looked at inequality and conflict, and they had found, using Gini's and so on, not any relationship. So they said, oh, it's nothing to do with inequality. But if you do the same thing with group inequality, you do find a relationship. And the reason is really fairly easy to see. And again, in a way, it's about getting ahead collectively, but this time it's fighting collectively. It's not quite so positive. But you do fight collectively in most of these conflicts, and you need a common identity to mobilize and bind you. And the incentive for the conflict is then group incentive, it's group inequalities. For people who lead the conflict, very often it's political inequalities, political exclusion. For people who follow, people who support the conflict, it's a feeling of injustice in terms of jobs or land and such like. So we find, and that started by being a hypothesis, that if you had high horizontal inequalities, you get more conflict, but indeed there's accumulating evidence all around the world in case studies and econometrics that indeed is the case. So that's the second reason, a very important reason for being against horizontal inequality. Yet despite that, it's neglected in much policy. Well, traditionally the World Bank and so on have neglected inequality altogether, and both vertical and horizontal, but now there's much more focus. And on the whole, it's a more focus on vertical inequality. There's very little measurement or monitoring in a systematic way of horizontal inequalities. That's at the global level. At the national level, countries which actually confront these inequalities do take policies. So they are much more acknowledged and dealt with at the national level. And it's my view that this is going to become an increasingly important issue with the rise in international migration. Now, having said that, I want to turn to a global example. One issue which is quite interesting, and again it's the philosophers, is whether the scope of justice actually applies globally. And it's interesting that Rawls's theory applies within a nation and not across nations. And I've always found that slightly uncomfortable that you don't apply it across. And there are several people who don't think it does apply. So, on the other hand, the human rights approach would say, yes, every human is entitled, and we shouldn't say just because they're not part of our society that they're beyond the pale. And of course, that is the approach that every development economist takes. Otherwise, we wouldn't be a development economist. But putting that aside, I want to think about instrumental reasons. Does it have an effect on political stability? And I want to use the example, and I shall rush through it rather quickly, the example of Muslims in the world today as a case of very systematic horizontal inequalities. And in my view, it's a horizontal inequality which is behind a lot of the tensions in the world today. So, first of all, one has to say, of course, that there are many, many subgroups within Islam, so that to talk about them as a single unified group is to not do injustice, and in not only injustice, but many Islamic groups are actually fighting each other, like the Shias and the Sunnis, Alawites. You know, there are many, many conflicts. Nonetheless, at least my hypothesis is there's a sort of global identity. There's the Ummah, the sort of universal mythical homeland, and I'll have a little bit of evidence on that. In addition, there's systematic multidimensional horizontal inequalities. Within European countries, I started this thinking very much of my own society, but also other European countries, within developing countries, and between Muslim and non-Muslim countries. So starting in Europe, just looking at the UK very briefly, Muslims in the UK live in poor, segregated neighborhoods. They have worse education, worse health, worse employment, lower incomes, form more of the prison population, and their overall well-being is worse. Politically, they're underrepresented. Culturally, they're really abused in a way. They're not recognized. And I'm just quoting UK, but I looked at similar evidence for a number of other European countries, and you find the same. Interestingly enough, you don't find it in the US. I thought since I was talking in the US, I ought to have a quick look at the data, and I was interested to find, and I think this is because of selective immigration policies, that at least on the economic side, there is broad not broad equality, but not minor inequalities. However, there is more discrimination. On the discrimination side, on the political side, on the cultural side, there are inequalities, but on the economic side, there are much fewer inequalities than in Europe. In Asia and Africa, you find systematic inequalities. Of course, you find some countries where Muslims form the whole population and the issue doesn't arise. You find a number of countries where there are a considerable majority, and they tend to have political dominance in those situations, but economic relative deprivation. You find some countries where they form a significant minority, like India, China, Thailand, and so on, where they are systematically less well off, and also in Africa. So these are just a few examples. In India, we know that the Muslims form a very substantial proportion of the population and are systematically deprived in every dimension. Philippines and Thailand, we find the same thing. West Africa, we find the same thing. Within Israel, which of course is a sort of key spot which is what gets global attention, there are very systematic inequalities between Jewish Israelis and Muslim Israelis. And of course between Israel and Palestine. And if you just look at the right-hand column, you see the ratio of Israel to Palestine. You know that the income is almost 10 times as much. The infant mortality rate is just a fraction in Israel. And then we also find, if we look at Muslim countries as a whole and other non-Muslim countries as a whole, we also find inequalities. Of course, there's a lot of non-homogeneity. There are some rich countries within the Muslim category, and there are some very poor countries within the non-Muslim. So there's some, but what we find looking at this chart is that the percentage which go into the high human development category are much higher among non-Muslims, and the percentage going in the low human development category is much higher among Muslim countries. So, overview of the evidence, we find very, very systematic inequalities. Question is, does this mean anything? Is there any global connection between people all over the world? And that's the sort of next part of the evidence, which I shall certainly not be able to say much about, but just illustrate with this diagram the type of connections worldwide. Media connections, remittance connections, family connections, education and training connections, and pilgrimage connections, all of which there's a lot of evidence on all of these, and I shan't be summarizing it, but it can be very big. I mean, in Bangladesh, I think remittances account for 5% or something of GNP, very, very large. It's also interesting that when people do perceptions, ask questions, these are particular questions where you'd expect differences in answers, but when they ask Nigerian Christians and Nigerian Muslims who's responsible for the cartoon controversy, is it Muslim intolerance or Western disrespect, you obviously get very systematic differences. If you ask who's responsible for your lack of Muslim country prosperity, is it Islamic fundamentalism or Western policy, it's hardly surprising, but you get very different answers. I haven't got the chart here, but I have right at the end, but I wasn't sure I'd have time for it. If you ask people in Europe what identity they put first, is it being a Muslim or being, say, British, there's a lot of variation, but the majority usually put Islam before their country. So is there an overarching identity? Well, yes and no. And these are some quotations which indicate that this is a complicated, obviously, issue. You can't be decisive, but I think you can be suggestive, and I think there is a sufficient overarching identity that grievances in one place of the world get reflected in action elsewhere. For example, there was a statement of a British Muslim saying it's all one and the same, the struggle in Afghanistan and Iraq and even Britain. It's all connected. That's really the point I'm making. And a child in Britain, I'm getting bullied at school, people in the neighborhood are calling my family terrorists. You see, it's not only an inner sense of identity, it's what you're caused from outside. Go back to your own country. I'm worried they'll start saying these things at school. Muslim boys are getting beaten up at school. And the last one is a little quote I just saw very recently by some Boko Haram Islamists in Nigeria. The presence of France in Mali has launched a war on Islam, and we're fighting it everywhere. Again, this sense that there is a universal identity. Now, of course, in any of these conflicts, and I've studied many, and not all Islam by any means, many ethnic ones, it's not that the whole group feels like that. The same was true of the Holocaust, and it's not the whole group feels it, but it's the extremists who feel it, and the extremists manage to take action and get action happening. So it's not that everybody would feel it, but there's enough going on to give meat to the extremists or the leaders if they want it. So let me then come to conclusions. First, that horizontal inequalities are basically unjust and may raise the risk of conflict, and that this applies internationally as well as nationally. So globally, it's a question of redistribution of power as well as economic prosperity. And I would like to emphasize the politics as well as the economics, because what we found in our research on conflict, and it comes out very clearly both in case studies and econometrically, is that when you have both political exclusion and economic exclusion, that it's most likely that you get a conflict. If you have just economic exclusion and not political, it may be fine, you can manage it. I mean, this is the way, for example, Nigeria manages these huge inequalities between North and South Nigeria, that the Northerners are very often in political power, not always, and it's when they're not in political power that there's a sort of dangerous issue. Same with Côte d'Ivoire, conflict arose when the Northerners were excluded politically. When they were included politically, even though there was still economic exclusion, it was all right. So you must always look at the politics as well as the economics. So globally, it's a question of the redistribution of power and economic prosperity within Western societies, and I'm talking here more about Europe than the US, but I think we tend to treat in Europe all this as being out there, something that's got to be done. Well, of course, we're causing more trouble in Afghanistan and Iraq, but it's out there. Maybe we should go and do something about northern Mali, and maybe that will help. What about Britain itself? And I think it's all connected, so I think it is within northern societies as well as within southern and between them, and that one needs very systematic monitoring, which we don't have. And of course, what we do have is a policy which focuses on repression rather than on inequality, which is not going to be effective. I mean, it's effective in the short term, but means you continue to have a problem in the long term. And given the migration patterns, the issue is likely to become increasingly important. Thanks.